Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the Blazing Trails Through the Jungle of Food Regulations presentation, so I hope you're in the right place. This is a project of the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, Minnesota Farmers Market Association, Renewing the Countryside, and Extension. And my name is Jane Jewett. I actually live in this area. I'm about 40 miles away, and I have a farm. So I was bottle feeding a lamb and a goat this morning. But I also work for the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, and I work a lot on food regulations. So that's what we're going to talk about. This project, Blazing Trails, was originally funded by the North Central Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program of the USDA. And we have two SARE representatives at this table over here, Katie and Marie. And if you're interested in any materials about sustainable agriculture, they brought a whole pile with them. They have some brochures and things, so talk to them. This project is supported with information and review by the local food advisory committee, the Minnesota Department of Health, their food regulatory division, and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Food Regulatory Division. And if you're interested in seeing a whole pile of reference materials on this topic, this QR code will take you to the Blazing Trails page. Otherwise, if you just Google on Blazing Trails Food Regulations, the page on the MISA website should come up. We have a bunch of links on there. All right, I'm going to start out talking about the landscape of food regulation, particularly focused on Minnesota. This resource, the Office of the Reviser of Statutes, is a really good resource that we want everybody to know about. It's where all the Minnesota laws and Minnesota administrative rules are published. And so if you ever need to look up the exact language of a law, that's where you find it. We find that very useful from time to time because the wording of statutes is, they're not the way normal people talk, right? And so regulators even will take shortcuts, they'll use examples, they'll say things that sometimes take them away from the actual language of the law. And so it's useful to sometimes just go back and look at what it actually does say. So the landscape of food regulation, there are federal rules and laws, tribal, state, and local, and they all interact with each other in different ways. It's complex and it can be really confusing, but we're going to go through kind of the basics of some of those interactions and which entity has jurisdiction over which things. So we're going to start with Minnesota state law. In Minnesota state law, there is a definition for food. And that includes every ingredient that is used in anything that humans will eat or drink, except for edible cannabis products. Those are specifically now defined in the law as not food. And then there's a definition of sell and sale. And I like to have somebody read that out loud when I'm in person because it covers a very broad gamut of things. So anybody volunteers to read that out loud? Marie, go ahead.
Sure. Let's see. Keeping, offering, or exposing for sale, use, transporting, transferring, negotiating, soliciting, or exchanging food, having in possession with intent to sell, use, transport, negotiate, solicit, or exchange food, storing, manufacturing, producing, processing, packaging, and holding of food for sale, dispensing or giving food, or supplying or applying food, and the conduct of any food operation or carrying food in aid of traffic in food, whether done or permitted in person or through others.
Thank you, Marie. Okay, that is, That is the legal definition of sell or sale in Minnesota state law. And so to kind of bring those down a little bit, food is every ingredient involved in something humans will eat or drink except for those cannabinoids. And sell or sale is any time food changes hands in any way out in the public sphere. It doesn't cover private family exchanges of food, passing the potatoes around the Thanksgiving dinner table. That doesn't count as a sale, but anytime there's food moving from one entity to another out in public, that is considered a sale, whether there's money involved or not. Okay, we're going to go through a couple of definitions of, yes, sure.
Does this cover seed?
Seed for planting? No, it does not. Yeah, but if you eat your seed corn, that's food. All right. There are a few definitions that come up when we're talking about food regulations. Regularly engaged in the food business. So this is a term that is used by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, MDA. It's not used by the Minnesota Department of Health, MDH. It doesn't have an official definition in the law. Well, it sort of does, but it's a squishy one. So it means any person who operates a food business over a period of time at uniform, consistent intervals. And then that symbol of the arrows going different directions and the question mark, that means there's regulatory discretion. So the Department of Agriculture is the one that gets to decide whether your food operation is uniform and consistent enough to be considered regularly engaged. Then there are some other terms that come up a lot that aren't necessarily defined in law. The end consumer or the ultimate consumer, that's the person who's going to eat the food themselves or serve it to members of their family or their household or to non-paying guests. And then the point of sale is where that food becomes owned by an end consumer. And that can be several different places, including online, right? You can sell something online and then the person that bought it owned it. So that can be a point of sale. The place where you physically hand over the food to that customer can be a point of sale. Community event is an organized event with a defined start and end time in which multiple participating vendors are open to the public. So community event is a term that's used in some other regulations, and that's how the Department of Agriculture defines it. Then there are wholesale sales and there are retail sales, and this is surprisingly complex for folks to figure out sometimes. So wholesale includes anything, any transfer of food up to the point where that end consumer gets it. So wholesale includes sale or delivery to any entity that then is going to distribute or serve or sell that product again, which confuses some folks because you think of wholesaler as something big like Cisco food service trucks or Russ Davis wholesale trucks, but wholesale includes a whole lot more than that. And then retail sales are the sales to the end consumer again, that person who's going to eat it themselves or serve it to their family or their household members or non-paying guests. That's the only thing that's retail. Few more things. Approved or approved source of food. Those are sources of food that food businesses and food facilities are legally able to buy. And that's defined in Minnesota administrative rules. And then there are exemptions and exclusions to requirements for food licensing. So they tend to get interchanged. Even food regulators tend to use one or the other when they mean the other one. But an exemption is something that's given in statute with requirements that are spelled out that are specific to that exemption. And an exclusion is slightly different. It's something that's carved out of the law. So the law may say you must have a license to sell food, but if you meet these characteristics, you're excluded from needing a license. And we'll talk about that a bit more when I get to product of the farm. Current good manufacturing practices are actually federal standards for the sanitation and the equipment and construction and operating processes used in production of food at the wholesale level. They're part of the Code of Federal Regulations. States typically adopt that, which the state of Minnesota has done, and uses those as the basis for state regulations on what's required for food processing. The Food and Drug Administration is in charge of those, but they delegate enforcement to state agencies. So current good manufacturing practices, we'll see these pictures a couple more times. This is an example of a facility. It's a very small community center located in Swat-Terra, Minnesota, which is about 30 miles away from here. And I'd just like to show these pictures to show that a facility that can be used for food processing doesn't have to be super fancy. This facility is used by 2 licensed food manufacturers in Minnesota. As you can see, it's not stainless steel from wall to wall, not at all. It has sinks. It has the required triple wash sinks and a hand washing sink and a range hood over the range. There's a restroom off to one side that you can't see in the photo. And so it has the basic things that are needed for food manufacturing. All right, a little bit of history here on the food laws in the United States. So the United States Department of Agriculture has jurisdiction over meat, poultry, and eggs. And that started way back in 1906 with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Sometimes we hear folks say that these laws are new. This is a new thing. It is not. It's more than 100 years old. The Poultry Products Inspection Act was a revision. The Meat Inspection Act originally included poultry. Then it was expanded more in 1957 with that Poultry Products Act. And then the Food and Drug Administration has jurisdiction over everything that is not meat, poultry, and eggs. So the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance in 1924. Anybody know why pasteurized milk? Why is that a law? And why 1924? Anyone? Okay, it was because of tuberculosis. The dairy cattle herds in both the United States and Britain were riddled with tuberculosis, and there was a 3-pronged public health move to pasteurize milk, get rid of cows that tested positive for tuberculosis, and do consumer outreach and training to teach people to put milk in their refrigerators. So that was a successful public health campaign. There's very little TB in this country anymore. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed in 1938. That was an expansion of the original from 1906. And then there was really nothing more until 2011. So like a 70-year gap of no changes in those federal laws until 2011 with the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. Which FSMA includes a whole bunch of things. The one that was brand new for people really was the produce safety piece. And, up until then, produce hadn't really been regulated. Now it is under the FSMA produce safety rule. There's a lot of information on that too that I'm not going to get into, but there are trainings available from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and Extension pretty regularly on that. You can read this poem to yourselves if you like. It's something I found that was written in 1907, right after those original food laws passed. And I like it because it's showing all the same questions that people have today about food regulations, concerns about what those inspectors are up to when they're out at your facility or on your farm. And the inspector questions are not that much different from 100 plus years ago. You know, how far away are the pigs you keep? How far are the animals from your produce production areas so you don't have cross-contamination? How healthy are your animals? Is there sickness in your home? Does your sister have measles or whooping cough? Do you have clean water? Excuse me, I must examine your hand. You know, have you washed your hands lately? All of these things are still part of regulatory authority today. So here's a little table that breaks down which federal agency is responsible for which things. USDA, again, meat, poultry, and eggs, and catfish, or catfish relatives, which are called siluriforms, which I saw that word and I'm like, what on earth? So I had to look it up. The USDA does inspect catfish. And then if there are products that are made that contain more than 2% cooked or 3% raw meat, those also come under USDA jurisdiction. So things like pizzas, and this is for wholesale, so it would be like frozen pizzas that are getting made to be distributed and sold in grocery stores. Other types of meat products, empanadas, sandwiches, those kinds of things. And then the Food and Drug Administration has jurisdiction over everything else. Fish, shellfish, snails, crickets. There are people raising crickets for food in Minnesota. Milk and all other food. So going now from federal to state and how those laws interact with each other, I mentioned that states typically adopt the federal law by reference, and states can be stricter than, but not less strict than USDA or FDA. So Minnesota has chosen to be stricter on a few things. Amenable farm-raised game species is one. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about meat and poultry today because there's a whole other slide deck that goes with that, and we're not going to have time. But farm-raised game species are historically wild game in North America. So bison, elk, deer, rabbit. The USDA says those are not amenable to inspection. As far as the USDA is concerned, you can get those processed and sell them without inspection. Minnesota says, no. If those are raised on a farm in Minnesota, it's meat. You know, bison is meat as much as beef is meat, and we want it inspected if it's going to be sold in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, those species do need to be slaughtered and processed under inspection if they're going to be sold. The federal law has 7 different types of exemptions for on-farm poultry processing. Minnesota allows 2 of those. And then the Minnesota Food Code is based on the federal food code, but Minnesota also has a number of areas where they're stricter on various things. Okay, at the state level, there are statutes and there are administrative rules that explain the statutes in more detail. There are no variances allowed to state statute. The statute is the statute. Again, some of the language is sometimes a little fuzzy and there can be regulatory interpretation. State rules, though, have a process to request a variance. So in some cases, you can do things that are not specifically allowed in the food code if you can get that variance and demonstrate that what you're doing is at least equal in terms of food safety to what the food code requires. I said that already. Okay, then sovereign nations. So in general, and this can vary because each sovereign nation has its own treaty situation, right? But typically on federal trust land or reservation land, activities there are subject to tribal law. The sovereignty extends to food. On fee land and land privately owned by tribal members, activities are typically subject to the same federal, state, and local laws as the rest of the state of Minnesota. But it's really a gray area when a food product is made on trust land but sold elsewhere. That's something that is still kind of a fluid discussion ongoing. There could be regulatory discretion in there. We'll talk about that some more. Then there's local law. So outside of tribal jurisdiction, there are local ordinances, township or county or city, and zoning is under jurisdiction of the local entity, whatever it is. Local zoning always wins, okay? There can be variances and conditional use permits to zoning restrictions on certain activities, but even if you are legally able to do a food business according to state law, but your local zoning says you can't do it here, local wins. Local is also responsible typically for requirements on drinking water, septic systems, trash removal, parking, lighting, all of those kinds of things. Okay, popping back a sec to the state regulatory authority. So there are statutes in the state of Minnesota that give the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health the authority to inspect food production areas and to enforce food safety requirements. So typically this is attached to licensing. If you have a licensed food business, you are going to be inspected by someone from the Minnesota Department of Ag if it's food production, Minnesota Department of Health if it's food and beverage service. But even if you don't have a license, if you're exempt, maybe you're a cottage food producer using that cottage food exemption, maybe you're a farmer growing produce and you don't have to be licensed for that. But these agencies still have the legal authority to inspect and enforce. And typically they will only do that if there is an issue. If there's an illness outbreak somewhere that's pointing back at you, they will come check things out. And they have the authority to see that that an unsafe food condition is corrected. So here's the full language of Minnesota Department of Ag's inspection authority. It's long. We are not going to read it out loud, but it's similar in tone to what Marie read earlier. There's a lot of words in there. Here's the MDA's enforcement authority, that they may carry out enforcement duties. And then the Minnesota Department of Health has the same authority under a different statute. So Minnesota has the statutes. We have this administrative rule that's very long called the Minnesota Food Code. Sovereign nations can also have a tribal food and agriculture code. And there is an example of that. It was created by Janie Hipp, who's Chickasaw. She's the director of this Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas Law School. And so there's this model tribal food code that's available if anybody wants to look at it, that could be adopted, adapted, used by any tribe. Okay, cross-border sales. I'm going to keep coming back to cross-border sales because that's really relevant to tribes that have food activities happening on a reservation, if that food may then move off reservation. So if food is crossing a border between states or a reservation border for sale, that food is for sale, it comes under FDA or USDA jurisdiction because those are the federal agencies that deal with interstate commerce, right? It also has to meet the laws of both the state or reservation it comes from and the one it's going to. And the State Department of Agriculture and Department of Health do not have inspection authority on tribal trust land. So that's a key point that can be a sticking point for folks who want to for instance, use a kitchen on a reservation and sell the product elsewhere. We'll talk about that more too. So now we're going to pivot just a bit and talk about product to the farm and cottage food, and I'll keep coming back to the cross-border situation. The state of Minnesota Constitution has a provision, Article 13, Section 7, that says that farmers or gardeners who are selling the products of land occupied and cultivated by them are not required to have a license to sell those products. And then that constitutional language is backed up in that Minnesota statute, 28A.15, subdivision 2. So what this means is that product to the farm is an approved source of food. It's legal for food businesses to buy product of the farm, even though it is excluded from licensing. Remember that exclusion is that carve out. You have to have a license to sell food, but if you're selling food that you raised yourself on your own land, you're excluded from that license requirement. Question? You can take it somewhere else to sell it. Or you can sell it to a school, restaurant, hospital. Yep, because it's approved source. That means food businesses, food facilities can buy it. Yep, with some restrictions when we talk about meat, poultry, and eggs. Then there are inspection requirements. There's a whole universe there. So this approved source fact sheet is from the Minnesota Department of Health. And this is the thing that if you do want to sell to a school, restaurant, hospital, etc., you want to print off that fact sheet and take it with you to prove to the buyer that it's legal for them to buy your product of the farm, because many of them do not know this. And what you need to do is print that sheet, get a yellow highlighter, and highlight the second paragraph on that sheet, which says that it's legal to buy from local growers. Because the first paragraph starts out with wording that says you must purchase food from commercial sources under regulatory control. And hardly anybody reads past that sentence to read the next part that says local growers are an approved source. All right, everybody is required to only sell safe, non-adulterated food. That's bottom line, regardless of whether you're excluded or exempt or licensed or what have you. That is a requirement. So how do you do that with product to the farm? You follow good agricultural practices for produce production. And again, University of Minnesota Extension does trainings all the time on this. You follow current good manufacturing practices, or CGMPs, for processing. Those are not excessively complicated. They basically mean that you need to have an adequate facility. And I showed pictures earlier of something that qualifies as an adequate facility. Typically not a private residence. Those can rarely meet CGMPs, even if you have an amazing all stainless steel kitchen, because if you're cooking your own food, if you have pets, if you have allergens that are going to cross contact with other food that you're making, CGMPs are hard in a private residence. And then also the Minnesota Food Code states that a food establishment, like a restaurant, like a school, cannot purchase food that was made or stored in a private home.
Question going back to this thing about having stuff in your own home and then not being able to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can produce it on the farm, but you're not allowed to bring it into your root cellar or something like that?
Well,
it has to go somewhere else?
A root cellar would not be your private kitchen, right? Home is like your private living quarters. That's how the law views it. So if you've got a root cellar that's not, you're not setting up a sleeping cot in your root cellar, that's not your private living quarters. So here are a bunch of things that can be product to the farm. And again, meat, poultry, and shell eggs, I'm not really going to get into. I'd be happy to another time, but it's going to take another hour and a half for that discussion because it's really complex. But there are a lot of things that can be product to the farm as long as you're not adding off-farm ingredients. I'm highlighting maple syrup and wild foraged foods here because here's where a tribal situation can be a little bit different. So in seeded, yes, Anthony?
So for fish, I'm sorry, does that include harvest fish or farm fish?
That would include farmed fish. Yeah, unless you're a tribal person with hunting, fishing, and gathering rights in ceded territory. So in ceded territory, tribal members with retained gathering rights can forage or harvest and can sell those products in Minnesota. They're treated the same as product to the farm under Minnesota law. So that constitutional provision that you can sell or peddle the products of your farm or garden occupied and cultivated by you, that language has been interpreted to apply to tribal members foraging on ceded territory. Now that's something that needs to be paid attention to over time because staff members change at the Department of Ag. And we've already had the experience where a new staff member came in, didn't know that history, was saying, no, you know, if you're foraging on public land, you have to have a license. Yeah, but not if you're a tribal member gathering in ceded territory. We have to keep reminding. But you may need a permit from a tribal authority to forage for commercial sale, and same for fishing for commercial sale. You know, there may need to be a permit from the tribal authority for that. So wild mushrooms can qualify as product of the farm if they're harvested on the seller's owned or rented property or gathered in ceded territory by tribal members. But here's where we get into some kind of tricky interaction cross-border. If you're going to sell those wild mushrooms to an entity that's under the jurisdiction of the state of Minnesota, you must have a certificate of training in wild mushroom identification and be registered with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. You don't need that registration if you're only selling to those end consumers, people buying it at the farmer's market for their household use. But if you want to sell to a school, restaurant, grocery store, you have to have that certificate and registration. And the Minnesota Food Code requires a course in mushroom identification that includes actual fresh mushroom specimens. The Minnesota Mycological Society offers that training. If you want to be certified in multiple types of fungi, you need to kind of plan a whole year of taking different pieces of that course, right? Because different mushrooms are out at different times of year. Then other wild forage foods don't have the same requirement as wild mushrooms. They're not nearly as deadly, potentially. So, you know, herbs, edible flowers, nuts, other edible plants, portions of plants, things you might gather and make herbal teas out of, they can be product of the farm as well. So Minnesota law on the product of the farm sales of whole raw produce and other whole raw commodity type things does not discriminate based on the location of the farm. Farmers from other states can sell or distribute whole raw product of the farm in Minnesota. Farmers from Wisconsin can bring their rutabagas into Minnesota and sell them. Native farmers growing food on a reservation could do that too. Sell whole raw produce off reservation, if you wish. Okay, what about processed product of the farm? So, product of the farm can include processed fruits and vegetables. There's a lot of misconception about this. People think if you start processing something, you need a license, but that's only true if you're adding off-farm ingredients to it, or if someone other than the farmer who grew it is selling it. So processing is not an action that requires a license. However, depending on the kind of processing you're doing, You might need an inspection, you might need a commercial grade facility, food safety plan, some certification for things like canning. And also very important to know that making vegetables presentable for sale is not processing, okay? So if you're harvesting whole raw produce, trimming the roots, trimming the tops, removing outer leaves, rinsing off the field soil, that is not considered processing. You can always do that, but your water that you use to do those things needs to have no detectable E. coli. That's about a $40 test from most labs in the state. So what is processing of fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, herbs, grains too? I should put grinding on here because grinding of grains counts as processing, and it can be product to the farm if you're not adding any off-farm ingredients. So peeling, shredding, dehydrating, bagging, canning, fermenting, slicing, wrapping. The items with a star on them, bagging, canning, and fermenting, those are things that can be higher risk, and they're considered special processes where you might need to have additional training or certification. The reason being with vacuum bagging, vacuum packing, and canning particularly, is that what you're doing is creating a zero oxygen environment in that package or in that jar. And zero oxygen is what Clostridium botulinum really, really likes. That's the bacteria that causes botulism. So those are higher risk. If they're not done right, if they're not done under the proper conditions with the proper process, you can have a botulism risk with those. But there are plenty of things that are not special process. Farmers can do these things with potable water or drinking water. Appropriate facilities, again, not a kitchen in a private residence, and appropriate processes following those current good manufacturing practices. So things like shredding and bagging raw cabbage when you're not using a vacuum sealer, peeling and slicing up carrots, chunking up a great big squash, freezing berries, freezing chunks of rhubarb, freezing apple slices, but if you treat those apple slices in a lemon juice bath, then you've added an off-farm ingredient unless you are growing your own lemons. Okay. So a little more on current good manufacturing practices. They're listed out in this Code of Federal Regulations in kind of regulatory speak. I'm working on a fact sheet that I was helped with by an extension educator a year and a half ago, and it's not done yet. I'm sorry, I swear. It's going to get done soon. But again, it doesn't have to be a super fancy space. It just has to be a space where, you know, it can be kept clean, no pets. Stainless steel sinks are a requirement. Smooth, cleanable, durable, non-porous surfaces. So you can see the cabinetry in here is wood. It's not real fancy filigree carved stuff that's going to be hard to clean. It's just flat. And it is varnished, so it's non-porous. And then the countertops are Formica, so they're non-porous, smooth, cleanable. Those are the basic requirements. Keeping insects and rodents out, having a separate bathroom with its own hand washing, those kinds of things. It's another view of that kitchen. Okay, questions about fruit and vegetable processing under the product of the farm exclusion? Yes?
I got lost somewhere in between, like, if it's not processed, then it's a product of the farm? Or-
Product to the farm can be processed also, as long as you're not adding any ingredients while you're processing. Right. Yeah.
So if I can it by adding salt or whatever, then it's not product of the farm.
Correct. Yep. If you add salt, if you don't have your own salt mine that you own, that you personally mine the salt from. Okay. I don't always tell this story because it's kind of gross, but I gave this training one time up on the North Shore, And I was talking about that salt thing where you can only add salt and still have it be product of the farm if you have your own salt mine. And this guy sat there and he thought, and he said, well, what if I take a squeegee outside with me on hot days, and as I'm sweating, I squeegee off my sweat and I evaporate the liquid off of it, and then I've got my own salt that I produced on my farm. Like, you know what? Whatever, dude, if you want to do that. Oh my gosh. Yeah, if you add salt that you acquired somewhere else, that takes it out of product to the farm. And then you'd be looking at using either the cottage food exemption or getting a license to produce that product. Okay, yes.
It's kind of piggybacking off that. So if berries were grown on a farm and you wanted to can, but the one product that you wanted to add to that canning would be something to sweeten it. If it's a tribal member and they are maple, they're doing their own maple sugar and using that, that would it have to be within the confines of the specific farm? Or is there any consideration for like ceded territory for a tribal member, and then you could bring that because you can dry maple syrup into sugar?
Yeah, so if it's the tribal member's farm where they're growing the berries, and then they're also harvesting maple sap in ceded territory and making their own sugar, I would say yes, that would be product of the farm. Yeah. There might need to be a conversation with the Department of Agriculture to say, here is why this should count as product of the farm. But yeah. Okay, so cross-border sales of processed products of the farm with no added ingredients can be a little bit trickier than the whole raw vegetables. Whole raw vegetables, that's clear, no problem. But when you're talking processed, there are states that have differing laws. Minnesota has that constitutional product of the farm provision. Neighboring states don't. So farmers from the neighboring states of Wisconsin and North Dakota, if they're going to process product to their farm for sale to food facilities, they have to have a license to do that. That's the law in those states. So Minnesota would allow those products to come in, but where they're produced, they're required to be under a license. So that's the cross-border thing there. This is a gray area with tribal trust land. Would Minnesota allow sale of processed products of the farm from tribal trust land to come into Minnesota? They should. It's a little bit of an open question. So what if a tribal member grows product of the farm on reservation, processes the product with no added ingredients on reservation, and then sells it off reservation in Minnesota? Minnesota should accept this sale. It's more likely that there will be serious concerns if there are special processes involved, like the canning or the vacuum sealing. Because, again, Minnesota Department of Agriculture has no inspection authority on reservation, right? And that's their concern. If they can't go there and inspect, they don't want to allow it. Okay, mixed ingredient products. This gets to your question earlier. Yes, mixed ingredient products can be product of the farm so long as every single ingredient in there is produced by you on your farm or garden or foraged on ceded territory. What if you can't produce every ingredient yourself? You can either get a license or use the cottage food exemption. But always, you're responsible for the safety of your product that enters commerce. Even if other people mishandle the product after it leaves you, you could still be held liable if they become seriously ill because they did something wrong. So the moral of the story there is buy insurance if you're going to be in food business. Traceability requirements don't apply to every enterprise. It's required if you're licensed. If you're exempt or excluded, it's not a requirement, but it's a best practice. Traceability means knowing one step back and one step forward, where your products came from and where you're selling them or distributing them to. Any more questions about product of the farm? Okay, then we're going to talk about cottage food, which is an exemption from licensing. It's not a carve out from the statute, it's its own statute that spells out what the requirements are to be a cottage food producer. So registration with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is required to be a cottage food producer in Minnesota, and that comes with a training requirement. There are 2 tiers. So tier 1 in 2022 and going forward allows up to $7,665 in annual gross sales. The annual registration with the Department of Ag is free, and there's a free annual training. That's a PowerPoint that you go through and then take a little test at the end. Tier 2 allows up to $78,000 in annual gross sales. There is a $50 annual registration fee, and training is currently offered by Extension. It's required every 3 years, and they are charging $50 for it. The cottage food exemption applies to individuals. That's a key part of this law. So the tier 1, tier 2, individuals apply and are registered for that. And so if you have a family or a couple of partners, each individual in that grouping can register as a cottage food producer, and each of them can claim that dollar limit in sales. So if you, for example, have a couple that are both registered as cottage food producers at tier 2, you each get that $78,000 limit. And so then you're talking about some potentially real money, right, over the course of the year. Registration is required as an individual, but you can run your business as any entity recognized by the Minnesota Secretary of State, including a limited liability corporation. That was not originally in the law. It was a change made a couple of years ago because cottage food producers were demanding that they be allowed to have LLCs, so they got it. Okay. So cottage food allows only non-potentially hazardous foods, and the definitions of this are in that Minnesota Food Code. But what cottage food allows is products with pH of 4.6 or less, so that means acidic products that are not animal products, not pickled eggs, not pickled turkey gizzards, not pickled pig's feet. They have to be plant-based products. Or, and it's an or, you can either go the pH route or the water activity route, which means either a dry or a high sugar product. So dry products like cookies, breads, other baked goods without a whole bunch of juicy fruit added to them, or the jams, jellies, syrups that have a high sugar content. And when there's a high sugar content, it binds up the water, makes it unavailable to bacteria to use for growth. And so those products also have a low water activity. You must label each product with your name and address or with your name and cottage food registration number. That's important because these are homemade products. They're allowed to be made in people's private kitchens at their private residence. There are a number of reasons why people might not want to broadcast the address of their private residence all over the place. So they're allowed to have their registration number on there instead of their address if they choose. Cottage food labeling must include an ingredients list, should include sub-ingredients. And sub-ingredients are like, okay, so you're making chocolate chip cookies. One of your ingredients is chocolate chips. Those chocolate chips also have a list of ingredients. Those are the sub-ingredients. You're not required to list sub-ingredients, but if any of them are an allergen, you do have to list that allergen on your product label. And that's only required for the 9 allergens recognized by FDA. So that's wheat, milk, eggs, soy, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, and now sesame. Your label on cottage food products must include the words homemade and not subject to state inspection. And you also must have that same sign at your point of sale. And remember, point of sale can be a bunch of different things in our modern world with web pages and social media. And, you could have a tent at the farmer's market and be selling things online at the same time. So any place that's a point of sale, it's a good idea to post that notice. Cottage food can only be sold directly to the end consumer. That is a key limitation on cottage food. It cannot be sold to any food facility. It has to go to that person who's going to eat it themselves or serve it to their family or household or non-paying guests. And you're not allowed to ship human cottage foods. There are also pet treat cottage foods. Those can be shipped. So here's kind of a comparison of cottage food versus product to the farm. Cottage foods you can make in a home kitchen. Product to the farm has to be in a facility that meets current good manufacturing practices if you're processing it, right? If you're just storing it like in a root cellar, there aren't really CGMPs for that, just general keep the mice out. Cottage foods, only non-potentially hazardous foods. Product to the farm, only 100% product of your farm or garden. Doesn't have to be non-potentially hazardous. It could be meat, poultry, eggs. Those things are potentially hazardous, but they can still be product to the farm. Cottage foods has a sales cap. Product to the farm, there's no sales cap. Cottage foods, only those sales to individuals. Product to the farm, no restriction on who you sell to. You can sell to food businesses. And cottage foods must be delivered directly to the customer, except pet treats. Product to the farm, you can ship it. Hemp products comes up as a question with cottage food. There are 3 products that are designated as generally recognized as safe and allowed to be in food products in Minnesota. So that's the seed products, hulled hemp seeds, hemp seed protein powder, hemp seed oil. Those can be used in foods, including cottage food, but nothing else out of that cannabis product can be in food in Minnesota legally. Does that mean you're not going to see it out there at farmers markets? It does not mean that. You will see it, but it's not legal. So examples of cottage food, these are the high sugar or dry items where the water activity is typically less than 0.85, or the products are unlikely to support rapid growth of harmful microorganisms. There's been a bunch of testing done on baked goods in Minnesota, and we're finding that bread typically has a higher water activity than 0.85, but also the type of microorganism that it's going to have on it is a mold that you're easily going to see, right? So that's considered okay for cottage food to have bread. And then there are the acidic and acidified home canned and home processed foods. Canned fruit, pickled vegetables, fermented things like sauerkraut, vinegars, condiments, mustard, barbecue sauce, things like that, that have that low pH, which inhibits the growth of that bacterium that causes botulism. Now, on the cross-border sales, Minnesota's cottage food law allows producers from other states or from reservations to register as Minnesota cottage food producers. So Minnesota kind of has an open borders policy for cottage food producers. But if you're not under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, you're not allowed to sell the canned acidic or acidified products in Minnesota. You can sell all the baked goods, the jam and jelly, syrup, things with the high sugar content, but not those acidic or acidified things. And the reason for that is, again, botulism concern. If people messed up the pH level, canned something that was too high of a pH, the Minnesota Department of Ag wants authority to go in and shut down what they're doing, and they can't do that in other states or on reservation. So the options there are to sell only the baked items or the high sugar / low water activity items, or find a kitchen space that you can use where MDA does have inspection authority and make those canned products there if you want to sell them, in places in Minnesota. Taxes. So the Minnesota Department of Revenue collects sales tax. Most food is not subject to sales tax, but some is, and some cottage food is. And I'm not going to dive deep into that. There are some good fact sheets available to look at. But basically, the way the Minnesota state tax law is worded is if the same person is both making and selling a mixed ingredient product that is ready to eat, it is taxable. So that would include things like salsa, because you just pop open the jar, you can use it right away, right? It includes things like jam and jelly, which you just pop open the jar and you can use it right away. It doesn't include things like spaghetti sauce that you have to heat up, hopefully, before you eat it. Anyway, just be aware of that. And then candy, confection products that have no flour in them are taxable. So again, there are some good fact sheets here, and I am going to make this slide deck available afterwards, and it has the links in here so you can dive into that. Cottage food, also now you can do pet treats for dogs and cats as cottage food. You have to use human food grade ingredients. You have to label them the same way except for the allergen labeling you don't need. And the Minnesota Cottage Foods Academy is offered by the Minnesota Farmers Market Association. Everything you want to know about cottage foods is in exhaustive detail on their website. There's also that non-potentially hazardous foods list. I think it's up to about 15 pages now. Lists things that are yes and things that are no under cottage food. So that's really helpful. Okay, any questions about cottage food? Yes.
Yeah, what about feed? Let's say I wanted to produce some chicken feed from my farm. Does that fit under cottage food?
That does not. That's under a whole other division at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and you would need a feed license and whole other thing. Yeah, if you want to sell it as human food and tell people they can also feed it to their chickens, maybe. How am I doing on time?
It's 11:37.
Okay, we're getting close. So I'm going to talk now about licensed local food sales. So that is if you want to process a product that includes ingredients you didn't grow yourself, and you want to sell it to schools, hospitals, restaurants, etc. You can't do that under cottage food, but you can do it under a license. So individual farmers or others can get licensed by the Minnesota Department of Ag to sell food you didn't grow yourself on land you occupy and cultivate, or food with off-farm ingredients added. Food products produced under a license can be sold to any buyer, individuals, schools, grocery stores. Your sales are not restricted to those end consumers. There's no annual sales cap. So community-supported agriculture, that's where you have a box of vegetables or other farm products that the farm puts together and sells on a weekly subscription or biweekly or something. But it's pretty common that the farmer doing those CSA boxes will say, I have a heck of a time growing sweet corn. I'm just going to buy that from my neighbor down the road. Well, okay, but then that's not your product to the farm anymore. That's someone else's. So you, the CSA box producer, then need a license to be able to put your neighbor's sweet corn in your CSA boxes. Farmers market-based food hubs. Willa Lynn here is the manager at the Grand Rapids hub just up the road. That hub has a license. actually both a wholesale and a retail food handler license, because collecting farmers' products and boxing them for sale happens at 2 different locations. And then any other food co-op or food hub or brokers or distributors of food need that food handler license, because they're not distributing their own product to the farm. They're distributing someone else's product to the farm. Added off-farm ingredients, a lot of these products are similar to the kinds you can do under cottage food. It's just that if you're licensed, you can sell them to anyone, not just to end consumers. And some products like soup, salads, sandwiches, sauces, spring rolls, you cannot do under cottage food because those are potentially hazardous, but you can do them under a license. And then cannabinoid edibles, the not food. Again, a whole other universe of regulatory hoops on that, and a different office within the state government deals with cannabinoids. Specialized processes are things that create a higher food safety risk. We already talked about some of them: the vacuum sealing, the canning, the fermentation potentially, because if that isn't done correctly, you can wind up with a 0 oxygen environment and not enough acidity, so that can be a botulism risk. So you can do these things under a license, but you also need some more things. You also need a variance from the regulatory agency, and you need a HACCP plan, which stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. So that means you analyze all the potential spots in your process where bacterial or microbial contamination could happen, and you have a plan to control that at each point. And possibly you would need certification, especially if it's canning. There is a Better Process Control School training and certification for canning. So here's a list of some special processes that are listed in the Minnesota Food Code. Smoking, curing, acidifying, using additives as a method of food preservation. Reduced oxygen packaging, that's the vacuum sealing. Sprouting seeds or beans. Sprouts are considered highly potentially hazardous. They've been responsible for a ton of foodborne illness outbreaks. If you're doing sprouts, there's, again, another whole universe of regulations just for you. So cross-border sales of licensed products. Minnesota will accept food products from other states that were processed under a license in those states. If you're doing cross-border sales, you register with the Food and Drug Administration as a food facility. That's required, but it's free. If you're selling cross-border to a food business, so you're licensed in Wisconsin, you're selling to a food business in Minnesota, that's a wholesale sale. You don't need an additional Minnesota license for that. But if you're making a product under a license in Wisconsin and you're coming into Minnesota and setting up a retail space in Minnesota, like a farmer's market booth, then you need an additional Minnesota retail license for that sale. And here's where things are really tricky for native producers who want to produce a licensed food product on reservation. So there are some reservations that have kitchens available. Some of them are extremely nice kitchens. But if the tribe doesn't have a food code, a licensing process, and inspections, the producer is kind of stuck with not being able to use that space to sell food products off reservation. Because what they produce on reservation, if there's no tribal structure for licensing, then that food is not going to be licensed, and it can't then be sold off reservation. The option at this time is to use a food processing space off reservation that's under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota Department of Ag, and get a license to operate at that location. And then you can sell the food made at that location, anywhere that MDA has jurisdiction. There is a wrinkle here with nation-to-nation transport of products. So processed food products made on reservation can be transported to a different reservation for any purpose, really. as long as both the source tribe and the receiving tribe are okay with it. And passing through non-reservation territory with the products is okay if you're just going from reservation to reservation. A few other things about licensed local food. What if it's donated? That's a question that often comes up. What if I'm not selling it? What if I'm donating it? That goes back to that really long definition that Marie read. It includes dispensing or giving food. So donating food is still considered a sale. And that means it must be eligible to be sold. So it needs to be approved source. It can be product of the farm. It can be licensed food. Things that are not approved source are cottage food, custom exempt processed meat, poultry, or rabbit, on-farm processed poultry and rabbit, shell eggs that haven't been candle graded or labeled, wild harvested wild game, there's an exception that I'll get to in a minute, and food, again, made in a private home. Those are not approved source for donation to food shelves or community meals or anything like that. However, cottage food can be donated to a fundraiser bake sale. Venison that's wild harvested can be donated to a food bank or food shelf or feeding program through the Minnesota Venison Donation Program, which is jointly managed by Department of Ag and Department of Natural Resources. Traditional Native American foods, including wild game and wild caught fish, can be donated to a public facility. More about that on the next slide. And wild game can be donated to a registered charitable organization. So those traditional Native American foods, including wild harvested wild game, can be donated to a public facility that serves more than half Native American people. So schools serving more than 50% Native or Alaska Native children, elder care facilities, could be other examples. The facility in that case is responsible to ensure proper handling of the food. So they're responsible to take in that wild game carcass, look at it, say, yep, don't see any sign of spoilage, looks like it was handled well, and then be responsible for handling it well from that point forward to ensure food safety. You know what? That's all I've got right now. Thank you so much.